When it's our time to shuffle off this mortal coil, one of our body's last stops before reaching its place of eternal rest will be the funeral home, where it will be prepped and preened, ready for families to say their final goodbyes as we move to whatever awaits us on the other side. And while these funeral parlours may have a bit of an atmosphere given the nature of their day-to-day use, it's hard to imagine that anyone would want to spend their afterlife hanging around here, right? For the old building that once housed the Annison undertakers, that seems to be exactly what's happened. But before any talk of funeral parlours and embalming and coming here once you're already dead, we've got to go back a little further, well, a lot further actually, before the Annison Building was even there. Because in that area of the city of Hull, King Henry VIII had started a project off to build a citadel, which is basically just a big old fortified castle, as part of a plan to protect England from any attack via the east coast. That included the castle itself, as well as 2 blockhouses known as the North and South blockhouses. And these were basically just other areas aside from the castle building itself that were also fortified. They were smaller and used for things like lookout towers, storing weapons and all that sort of stuff. But the North Blockhouse in particular was important because it was designed to protect Hull's port, as well as to control who could use the River Hull. But it also had another use. Because Henry VIII, he was obviously famously the king who had 6 wives, and to even get to the point of marrying your second wife, he'd had a major falling out with the Catholic Church, who said that divorce is an absolute no-no. You're not allowed to do that. Don't care that you're the King of England, not happening. But this just marked the beginning of what descended into a very difficult time to be a Catholic in England. If you refused to convert to being a Protestant, you were in for a world of trouble. Being a Catholic actually became illegal. But obviously, we're talking about someone's faith here. Not everyone is just going to drop their entire belief system just because they're told to. These devout Catholics were known as recusants, and they were dealt with accordingly. The North Blockhouse, alongside being a store for weapons and such, was also used as a prison to hold these recusants, in conditions which I'm sure you're not in the least bit surprised to hear were absolutely disgusting, to put it lightly. Up to 16 prisoners were held all together, and there were some reports from the time that said that when the tide came in, the quarters where the prisoners were held would flood, so the ground was just constantly muddy and just all around disgusting. There were some people saying online that those recusants held at the North Blockhouse were executed. An execution was a known punishment for being a Catholic, although it wasn't the most common one, but it's really not a stretch to believe that people probably did die in the blockhouse just because of the living conditions alone. In September 1643, during the English Civil War, 5 men also died in an explosion that left the Northern Blockhouse pretty severely damaged. And this was really the beginning of the end for Hull Castle, in the form of being a strategic, fortified military stronghold. By the mid-1700s, the Northern Blockhouse and the curtain wall that stood nearby was almost completely in ruins, and the blockhouse was pulled down in the early 1800s. They didn't need this huge defensive structure. The world was moving on. Hull was becoming a growing port city, and so the area was redeveloped through the 19th century. But what also happened in the 19th century, and is a very important detail to this story, is that there was a fire in Witham in 1876. This was a devastating fire, and there was a family, the Annisons, who had lost almost everything. They'd owned 2 separate business locations. One where they ran their wheelwright business, so where they make and repair wooden wheels for carriages and things, and the other was a stables. Both of these properties were destroyed. I'm hoping they managed to get the horses out before the fire got to them, but that is a detail I couldn't find out, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that. The Annisons, they were obviously looking for somewhere new that they could begin to rebuild their livelihoods again, but the only difference was that they just wanted one property this time. The fire had obviously been a massive financial blow to them. Just realistically, they couldn't afford to buy both a stables and a workshop separately. And so, during their search, they came across that very same area where the Northern Blockhouse had stood. And there was either a building there already, which they bought and then completely reworked and rebuilt it, or they bought the land and built what would eventually become the family base of business operations for the next 100 or so years. And when they were building, they did something quite interesting. So they had their wheelwright workshop downstairs on the ground floor and stabled the horses upstairs. And then there's this big old ramp / staircase thing that leads out into the courtyard behind the building, where the horses would be led up the stairs, along a gantry, and into their stables on the first floor. And the Annisons, despite their setback with the fire, they were incredibly enterprising. They'd started off as wheelwrights, and then they'd moved into building whole carriages, so that makes sense then why the horses were stabled upstairs to me. It's not necessarily easy, but it's easier to get horses horses up and down stairs instead of manoeuvring whole completed carriages up and down a ramp. Can imagine gravity isn't particularly your friend in that situation. They then moved into hiring out these carriages for weddings and funerals, and it seems like they quite liked that, as they dove headfirst into the whole funeral business and started a family undertakers, which is what they really became known for. But aside that, they made Victorian bicycles, then with the advent of motor vehicles, they got into motorbikes and then cars. They also rented out parts of the building. Rington's Tea was here. Various different businesses, from a photographer, he had a studio here. There was a hairdresser and a tailor too. And from what I could see online, no one on Facebook had a bad word to say about this tailor. He was pricey, but he was excellent at his job, was Mr. Toderick. And then even Hull Mounted Police, they stabled their horses here for a time too. There was also a flat in the building that was rented out. I believe it's still in use nowadays as well. There was just a lot going on, but of course the bit that you're probably most interested in is the funeral parlour. And it was a fully kitted out funeral home. They had a chapel of rest where you'd go to see your loved one before the funeral. They had the cold storage and the embalming room to prepare the deceased, basically everything they needed. So with being known for being a funeral parlour, the building already has a strong connection to the more morbid side of things. But there is another reason that the Annison Building will always be synonymous with death. It's a bit of a tentative connection from what I've uncovered in my research, and it looks like there are some sources out there that maybe put a little bit too much emphasis into it. But basically, back in 1891, one of the businesses that were renting out space in the Annison Building was the photographer William Mortimer Edmonds. And on the 30th of July, 18-year-old Mary Jane Langley had visited his studio to get her portrait taken. Mary Jane Langley's body would be discovered in a ditch mere yards from her home by her own dad, William Langley, the next morning. And so before I get too much into it, what I mean by people putting a little too much emphasis on the connection to the Annison Building is that a lot of people were saying online that her appointment at the photography studio was the last time she was seen alive. But by the looks of it, it wasn't. There's also a photo floating around that a lot of people say is Mary Jane. Again, I don't think it is, but apparently it just looks very familiar to what her portrait would have looked like. But even with those extra little considerations, the fact is that a young murder victim did spend time in the Annison Building during her last 24 hours of life. The story that has been pieced together about that day was that Mary Jane left the photography studio at about 3 p.m. and she got on a train, and there's witnesses saying that they saw her at the train station and then getting off that train at the Marfleet railway station to walk home. Back at the Langley household though, Mary Jane hadn't turned up. Her dad was obviously a bit concerned by the time evening rolled around, but it hadn't been the first time that Mary Jane had just gone off unannounced. She had a fella called Albert Hall, and her dad William, he'd found a letter from Albert saying, "Yep, I'd love to meet you in Cleethorpes," which is a seasidey town about an hour away from Hull. So Dad put two and two together. Maybe she's gone to Cleethorpes with Albert. Okay, no worries. But the next morning, Mary Jane still wasn't home. William found out that Albert wasn't in Cleethorpes, and he hadn't even seen Mary Jane, so now she was definitely missing. Obviously, the next step is to go to the police now, and so William Langley started out to make the police reports, but not before telling his wife, Mary Jane's mum, who was also called Mary, about a weird dream he'd had the night before. He'd dreamt that a dog had ran out from a ditch that runs along the lane outside their house. In this dream, William had walked over to the ditch where he'd just seen the dog run out from to see the corpse of his daughter. Very scary dream when your daughter is currently missing and you're probably worried sick. But back in the cold light of day, his next port of call was the Hull police. Thing was, he'd obviously have to pass by that very ditch that he'd dreamt about to get to the train station. As he approached the ditch, he had this horrible sense of dread, almost like he knew what he was gonna see in there. He peered over into the ditch, and tragically, there she was. Mary Jane had been dumped in that ditch. There was no sign of a struggle there or anything, but her throat had been cut. Officially, that case from 1891 is still unsolved to this day, although despite an apparently botched police investigation, they did arrest a few suspects, including the photographer William Mortimer Edmonds, but some believe that Mary Jane's murder was the work of a guy called Frederick Bailey Deeming, who had murdered his first wife and 4 children before burying them under the floorboards in Merseyside. He was also responsible for the murder of his second wife in Australia, and it was for that murder that he was caught and subsequently hanged in 1892. But the circumstantial evidence that ties him to Mary Jane's case was that he was apparently released from Hull prison around the time of her murder, and his tried and true method? Throat cutting. But officially, as it stands, and probably how it will forever now stand, we don't know who killed Mary Jane Langley. And aside from this connection to an unsolved murder, the Annison Building itself potentially has a few recorded deaths actually on the property. It's said that Edward Stewart Annison, he died there, but then it also goes on to say that his daughter, Sarah Annison, she also died in the Annison Building. But I have a few issues with this because first of all, she died in 1865, which is before the Witham fire. So potentially before the Annisons even moved their business dealings and things into what is now known as the Annison Building, because unfortunately she passed away only 9 years old. Also, it was only written in one source and I couldn't find any other evidence to back it up, so I don't know for sure. And this is kind of the thing with the whole story. I'm just trying my best to piece together what I can find. But the Annisons, they're not like a famous family. They're not particularly a nationally recognised household name, so there's not really been loads of research done on them. And there's not a lot of records available online. I'm sure that if you go to the archives in Hull, you'll find out a lot more about them, but I'm just little old me researching all of these stories by my lonesome. I do not have time to do that for every single story, as much as I would love to, so we're working with what we've got here. On that though, there was a book written by the local historian Mike Covell, but I think it's out of print. I couldn't get my sticky mitts on a copy anyway. So there may be extra bits and pieces to this story, so like always, if you have more to add, please drop it into the comments. There was also a horrific story of an alleged death of a horse during the Blitz in World War II, because Hull was such an important port city which made it a target. Unfortunately, there was apparently one horse who was so terrified by the bombings during the Blitz, they spooked so bad that they bolted and ran headfirst into one of the walls of the stables and died. Which I can imagine the Blitz in Hull would have been utterly terrifying for the horses at that time, just horrific for everyone involved. The Annisons, they continued to run the funeral home from this building until the 1990s, and now the building has a late night pharmacy on the ground floor, and the upstairs is now a space that the community can use. From what I can see, they host community art projects and photography displays, things like that, and it looks like the building owners now, like they're really keen on preserving the history of the building. I mean, I can totally see why. To look at the Annison Building, it's giving Addams Family, very distinctive Victorian Gothic vibe to it. They still have the stable partitions in the stable blocks, the embalming room and the mortuary are still there. It certainly looks the part of an old, creepy, haunted house, right? And so I think the building owner was trying to get a local history museum off the ground here, but they needed to raise the funds. What's a creepy old building the perfect place for, in which you can also charge a little bit of cash? Ghost hunts, of course. And so now you can hire out the old Annison Funeral Parlour for a bit of paranormal investigating if that's your thing. Because from what I could find, it seems like you could very well be in for an active night. In the courtyard at the back of the building, dark shadows have been seen walking about. And upstairs in the stables, a lot of weird, unexplained sounds have been heard. Everything from whistling to heavy booted footsteps to random, really loud bangs that aren't anything to do with a draft or anything like that. Other people also report feeling overwhelmingly sick in this area for some reason, and that doesn't even come close to what is reported in the hayloft. Some people have seen figures walking from one side of the hayloft to the other, which, okay, yeah, creepy, but that's one thing. The next bit is just a whole other level, like it's 4 levels above, because apparently people have seen a dark, shadowy figure of a man crawling along the floor towards them. What? No thanks, I would like no part in this. You've got whatever you've got going on there, that's fine, we're done here, okay, thanks, bye. The embalming room also allegedly has the potential to make you feel particularly uncomfortable, as disembodied voices have been heard in this room. Others have claimed to have the feeling like they're being grabbed or even pushed by something unseen in the old mortuary, but there's never anything there, so unsurprisingly they usually make a sharp exit after that. Really can't say I blame them, to be honest. But there was one really interesting account that said that a woman wearing Victorian-era funeral clothing had been spotted wandering around the upstairs of the building. I think some people have connected the dots here and started saying that this is the spirit of Mary Jane Langley, as she is allegedly now rumoured to haunt the Annison Building, and she may or may not be responsible for the smell of the flowery perfume that randomly appears and disappears with no explanation. Like, you'll be hit with a wall of that old-fashioned perfume that smells like a florist's armpit that no one else in your group is wearing, and it's that strong anyway that you would have smelled it before now on them if anyone was responsible. But before you can make sense of it, it completely dissipates. There's no logical reason why that perfume smell was so strong and has now completely faded into nothing. Other people have reported seeing figures that look like Catholic priests, which might seem weird, right, in a place like this, with no real connection to religion at all, until you remember about the Northern Blockhouse and the prisoners who may have died here all those centuries ago. Because yeah, apparently they're haunting the building too. Lights also get turned on and off without explanation, doors will apparently open and close on request, quests sometimes. Objects will apparently get moved around. You might see door handles being turned, but there's no one on the other side of the door. There's also this one chair that has tape marks around it, and that's because apparently on multiple occasions, this particular chair has been found inexplicably placed upside down or even thrown across the room. Even though that would have been impossible, there's been no one up in that room for anyone to have done anything like that. But one thing that was reported was that it doesn't seem to matter where you go in the Annison Building. You may feel the overwhelming, dreadful sense like you're being watched by something you can't see. And that feeling is so strong that pharmacy staff refuse to go upstairs on their own. So next time you go to pick up your prescription in with them, maybe try to get to the Annison Building in daylight hours, or you might see something unexplainable that definitely isn't a side effect of any sort of medication. But I really do need to know your thoughts on this one, because this one was so interesting to look into. Because on the one hand, you've got staff members who are still working there downstairs in the pharmacy who are terrified of the building, but then whilst out on my travels around the internet while I was pulling all of the research together, I came across the woman who ran the hairdresser shop that was in the building in the 60s, and she's adamant that they never heard anything about the place being haunted back then, with a fair few people agreeing with her that they vividly remember spending time in the building. They even used to sit on the backs of the police horses as kids. And not even then, not even as kids sharing ghost stories, there wasn't a peep about it being haunted. And so I don't know about you, it just seems somewhat sus to me. From what I can tell, all of the ghost stories have popped up after they started offering ghost hunts. Is it convenient timing or a total coincidence and just that more people are coming forward because people are starting to talk about what could potentially be going on here? Could go either way. But personally, as it stands and from what I've found out, I'm not 100% convinced, to be honest. I don't want to discount anyone else's experiences though. Like I always say, I wasn't there, I don't know what did or didn't happen, and then the conditions around that experience, windy night, other people in the building, whatever it is. I would absolutely love to go to the Annison Funeral Parlour and see for myself maybe, because the research just ain't lining up with the stories. The connection with Mary Jane Langley may be being overinflated, so it just seems a bit weird why she would come back and haunt somewhere where she spent a few hours at most. The late night pharmacy staff may just be having their imaginations running away with them while they're working there after dark. Because this was the theme throughout the research, there weren't specific encounters, it was just they don't want to go in certain rooms alone kind of thing. And I don't know, it all just kind of sets off my alarm bells when they're making money off ghost hunts and things, but there doesn't seem to be any solid witness testimonies outside of what people claim to experience on these ghost hunts. And like I've said before, not knocking the business model is a great way to make money to preserve the building, and by extension of that, the history of the building, as long as the history being told is accurate. The only thing I will say is that if there truly is something going on here, I'd be more inclined to believe that it had something more to do with the Northern Blockhouse and the suffering and potential deaths of the Catholic prisoners, rather than any connection to the funeral home, a place where you'll go after you've died, you know? But if I'm way off the mark here, if you've had an experience you truly couldn't explain at the Annison Building, I really would love to hear all about it. Or even if you've lived in the flat or you've rented out one of the shops, if you've worked in the funeral home, or even now if you work in the pharmacy, you're probably the most qualified to speak on this, so please do share your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story, please do like the video, it really does help out. And if you're new here and you like what I'm doing, I'd love for you to stick around by maybe hitting the subscribe button. But that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Pray for me, I think I owe you an apology. Stop singing Korn, why have you got that song in your head? You haven't even listened to that song today. Do you like my new candles as well, by the way? I don't know if you can even see them. The other candle was doing my head in. I know that they've been there for a couple of weeks now, but I'm only just remembering to ask you.